So the Buffalo Bills, another loss in the divisional round to the Kansas City Chiefs. And, I think a lot of people around the league were thinking that the Bills were in this championship window. And going into last year, there were some people who thought the window closed. But there was points in the season where the Bills looked like the best team, or one of the best teams in the NFL.
Going into the playoffs,
really. Going into the playoffs, right. They were hot. They had make the offensive coordinator change, which may or may not have actually triggered them to get better.
Right.
But they went from a 500 team late in the season to okay, this is the team you don't want to play in the playoffs.
Yeah.
So I think the Bills are still set up to be really good next year, but what's going to get them over the hump? This is what all the AFC teams are trying to figure out. How do we beat the Chiefs? How do we get over that hump? How do we do it in Buffalo?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't believe in the idea that the window is closed or is closing necessarily for Buffalo. I think they are just in the same boat as a lot of those other teams that we talked about, where it's going to be hard from now on because you've got the big money quarterback on, a giant sum, taking up a huge amount of your salary cap. On the other hand, the reason that is the case is because he is one of the most impactful players in the entire NFL. So as long as you have Josh Allen, interceptions and turnovers notwithstanding, you're going to be thereabouts. Like, they are. There's almost nothing they can do to that roster to prevent that from happening. We saw, Andrew Luck drag terrible teams to the playoffs single-handedly because an elite quarterback playing at a high level is capable of doing that. So now, you might be stuck at a level where you can make the playoffs but not win a championship unless you maintain a reasonable roster around them. But I think the Bills are capable of doing that. Like, it's not so crippling, the contract, that they have no shot of making things happen. So I don't think things are as doom and gloom as maybe some people are painting them to be.
I like to use over the cap because they are the most reliable when it comes to cap numbers from a team perspective or a player contract perspective. And the Bills, so if you go to just cap space, you get the teams that are in the red, in the negative, whether it's overall cap space, effective cap space. Bills are third worst. They also have other articles because we know teams are going to restructure, and every team has different levels of restructure. Like you mentioned with Josh Allen, when you have that long QB contract, you've got far more flexibility at that position. But even with potential restructures and everything, the Bills are still among the lowest teams in the league as far as potential or possible cap space at the moment. So I think they're at this spot where the difference is going to be like last year or a couple years ago when you go get Von Miller and you're trying to make these aggressive moves to go and win a championship. I think they're going to have to be more shrewd with those moves. I think you'll have fewer of the splash plays in Buffalo, and I think every time that happens, it just puts a little bit more pressure on your drafting and making sure that you're developing young players from within who are inherently cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, the Von Miller move, I think, is one that's a good example of something that they're unlikely to be repeating. They took a swing at a Von Miller. You can see the case for it last year of he was the kind of player that could get them over the hump if he played well, and he was just totally anonymous. I mean, obviously the injury, coming back from injury, but once he was back, he just didn't factor at all. And he played quite a bit and just was barely there. And, there's these crazy stats of like how much per tackle they paid him. But forget that. I mean, he just didn't generate pressure. He didn't make an impact on the field for them in a way that they really could have used. So he's taken up a ton of money. I imagine they're going to try and get rid of him in some way, shape, or form and not repeat that kind of expenditure because that's the sort of move that now they can't really afford to make.
Yeah, where else? The other things that are happening in Buffalo, Gabe Davis will hit free agency this offseason.
Very likely.
What's that?
Very likely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying his goodbyes on social media and all that.
And he's basically been more or less supplanted by Khalil Shakir anyway, so it's a move. I don't see why they would bring him back, even if
There's also a lot of smoke around Stephon Diggs. A guy that there's always that smoke. In the history there is, look, Josh Allen's rise to becoming an elite quarterback did coincide with when they got Stephon Diggs and brought him in. And that's not to take anything away from the QB, but I think that's why when we talk about rookie contract quarterbacks, there's a history here of Josh Allen had Stephon Diggs. Tua gets Tyreek Hill, and Jalen Hurts gets A.J. Brown. Those things work hand in hand when you have that, every level, dude knows how to get open, guy can win at the catch point, trust factor. in that true number one wide receiver. Is Stephon Diggs really still that guy? Or do because the Bills hit a point this year where they tried to spread the ball around to rookie Dalton Kincaid a little bit more. You mentioned Khalil Shakir getting involved a little bit more. There were games where they spread the ball around more and more. There were games where they ran the ball. I do think that style for Buffalo over time will do them well. I mean, if you want to be positive as a Bills fan and you look at 2023 and this season, I think you could say, hey, you know what? We learned that we can rely on Josh Allen a little bit less. He's still special. He could still take over games. We found different ways to win games. We had the James Cook games. We had the defense really step up in the second half of the season. So I think that's encouraging. And I do think that we talked about this the last couple off seasons, right? They can't just rely on Josh Allen on every key down. And I think they've learned to spread the wealth a little bit more. Now it's going to be a matter of getting a few more of those pieces to spread the wealth so you have even more answers to win those games.
Yeah, the Diggs thing I think is only a problem if he is actively going to be a pain in the ass about it. Like, it's not a problem. You look at last season. I mean, Diggs still had 175 targets, including the playoffs. Like, that's more than he had the year before. It's more than every other year except his first season in Buffalo, where his target rate skyrocketed to the moon as soon as he got out of Minnesota and sort of proved, hey, look, he can, almost double his workload and get a similar type of player. So, given other players were making plays, given Josh Allen was playing really well, given the Bills finished hot and were playing incredibly well, even though Diggs wasn't necessarily the focal point of the offense, there's no reason for him to be upset as on a team level, right? So if you're looking at this and saying, there's always been the kind of conversation with quote-unquote diva wide receivers is, are they motivated by selfish desires, or are they just do they just believe that them having the ball is the best way of that team winning games? I think a lot of times it's the latter, and it gets confused for the former, but there's no reason for Diggs to believe that what's happening at the moment isn't the optimal way of them actually winning games and being the best version of themselves. So the only way it's a problem is if he's looking at this and saying, I simply need the ball more because I'm me, and therefore I'm going to demand that. If that's the case, they might have a problem. If it isn't, then Diggs is still an elite player. They found other high-end weapons in terms of Shakir, in terms of Dalton Kincaid. Dawson Knox is still there. Josh Allen, James Cook out of the backfield. This is an incredibly good offense if they keep it intact. And I think all of that there's no reason it wouldn't be Gabe Davis leaving as long as Diggs isn't motivated by essentially selfish reasons.
Yeah, so again, I think we do a lot of this on paper. On paper, it all looks pretty good. And then it's like, all right, you want to replace what Gabe Davis was. I see some Buffalo fans talking about the Gabe Davis experience where you're kind of in this hybrid of like, well, he brought a lot of value for a mid-round pick. At the same time, put the four-touchdown game, the famous four-touchdown game in the 2021 season in the divisional round, maybe set expectations through the roof. It's like, oh, dude, this guy can be a high-end 2 to go with Diggs, and he's going to have a 12-touchdown season and be the deep threat. I do wonder how much they want that next deep threat, the speed receiver. Shakir works better in the slot, adds a little yak ability. Buffalo wanted that a couple years ago, yak ability from Shakir. They get that from Kincaid, I think, as well. I think it's another year, though, where they might be looking for that legitimate deep threat. I thought Deontay Hardy might fill it a little bit. Maybe they give him that chance.
I mean, that's the thing. Gabe Davis became essentially just a designated deep threat, never really did anything else. Like, his average depth of target last season was 15 or something, which is way higher than anybody else in that roster. But Deontay Hardy, they have 3 people on the roster currently who all have the skill set to just run deep and take the top off of defense. They're not the same type of receivers as Davis, and maybe they're not as good as Davis, but Deontay Hardy, KJ Hamler, and even Andy Isabella, those are guys with legitimate blazing speed, particularly if you get them off press coverage, i.e. you line them up in the slot or you line them up as without not being the X receiver. They don't have to worry about getting jammed at the line. Just run deep, go deep, take the top off the defense, scare teams over the top. Maybe you won't have the production that Gabe Davis has, but the threat is there.
For fear of, I'm not going to mention any cut candidates anymore. For fear of the fan bases attacking. I'm afraid. They've bullied me. I don't want to misspeak. I don't want to get made fun of. I don't want to get taken out of context. But I'm looking on the defensive side of the ball in the secondary. You have Tre'Davious White missed the rest of the season due to injury. They traded for Rasul Douglas. Christian Benford had a bit of a breakout year by PFF grade standpoint, done a really nice job. So are they deep enough at corner that Tre'Davious White might be a cut candidate? That Tre'Davious White, like where do they try to find a little bit more cap flexibility here? And are the Bills at this point where you might have the big names like the Von Miller? I don't know if they benefit from cutting Von Miller at the moment, but the Von Millers and the Tre'Davious Whites, the bigger names, you start to move on from them for younger players. Or, again, a Rasul Douglas who came and played really well has one more year left on his deal.
Yeah, I think Tre'Davious White is certainly potentially available. I don't know if they would cut him. I think more likely is a lot of these guys are going to get restructured, and they're going to play that game of, just kick the money down the line type of deal.
Yeah.
One of the big, missing pieces of information, if you just look at the salary cap space for teams on places like Over the Cap, is the restructure ability of these teams. Like, how much capacity have they got to move that money into future years, essentially?
I clicked on one of the other articles that they have. Does show that pretty well. Still has Buffalo near the bottom of the league.
Yeah, I mean,
post restructure, but it gives you that ability. Like, they're going to get over. Like, being salary cap compliant isn't the goal here, right? The goal is to figure out enough flexibility to actually add value to your team.
Arjun Menon, who does stuff for PFF, and he's a big data bowl guy as well. He tends to post one of those, four-way graphs every year that shows kind of, how much salary cap space you got on the x-axis, and then how much capacity have you got to restructure in the y-axis, right? So you end up with teams that are either in great shape, they've got a lot of space, they've got money to move around, teams that don't have a lot of space, but they have the capacity to move the money around, or teams that don't have any space and no ability to move money around, who are in legitimate salary cap hell. And as we've said many times on the show, teams have gotten a lot better at not getting into salary cap hell. Even the teams that you think are, generally speaking, have the capacity to move a ton of money into future years, and that's simply how they play the game. So the Saints are always in that quadrant. They're usually the most extreme team in that quadrant. They're always a mile over the cap, but they always have the ability to restructure, $100+ million and get under the salary cap. That's just the way they play the game. So as this year, they are, again, where they normally are. The Saints is the most extreme team. But Buffalo has the, 1, 2, 3, 4th, 5th, or 6th, somewhere, I can't quite tell. They're all close together. The amount of money that they can restructure into future years and get under the salary cap, essentially.
Right.
So they've got a lot more flexibility than it looks like they have. If you just look at the bottom line figure and say, oh, man, they're $50+ million over the cap, they're in hell.
All right, so here's the next piece of the State of the Union, I think, for Buffalo is the defensive line. When I look at, it's another one of those depth charts where if you read all the names, there's some good names still there. But there's a lot of them aren't under contract going forward. So you still have Von Miller and Gregory Rousseau, but Daquan Jones at defensive tackle, A.J. Epinesa, Shaq Lawson, Tim Settle, Jordan Phillips, Leonard Floyd. They've tried to build a defensive line that was rolling 8 to 10 deep over the last couple of years. And to get back to that, I think it's going back to that bargain basement edge defender class of which some of them are Bills, right? Can they bring back A.J. Epinesa on the cheap? Can they bring, do they want to bring Leonard Floyd back on the cheap? Do they want to keep some of that defensive line intact? I think that's where they're going to have to make some moves this offseason, get that depth back on the defensive line.
Yeah, there's a lot of space there that needs to be filled. The Von Miller thing is interesting because they're kind of stuck with him without an unusual deal or like a late deal. They can't get rid of him, soon. They can't cut him like before free agency, really before any of the offseason stuff happens. There's a massive dead cap hit. It doesn't save them any money. In fact, it costs them money to do it. They can potentially trade him, and the later in the year that happens, post-June 1st designation saves them a lot more money. So, but at that point, you're like, well, who wants to trade for Von Miller, given what we've just seen from him? So they may end up basically just carrying him one more year and seeing how it goes.
Yeah, I would just tell him to play better.
Just tell him to play better.
That's what I would do.
Which has the added kind of, like, they need him. They actually need Von Miller still, or somebody to bring what Von Miller was supposed to bring. They're going to try and bring back Daquan Jones, I think, definitely, and he was a big loss for them when he went down and got hurt. But it is very, very thin.
So I think trying to maintain, trying to retain some of their own in free agency, even if they're on cheaper, shorter deals. When we get to the draft, I've seen a lot of people. You mentioned yesterday, there's a lot more tall vertical receivers in this draft that does mesh with what I think Buffalo could use to go with Stephon Diggs and Khalil Shakir and their tight ends. We've seen LSU's Brian Thomas attached to them quite a bit. Tez Walker would be in that conversation, not necessarily in the first, but at some point. Even Alad McConkey, not the size, but I don't think he's a slot only. I think he's another speed receiver, speed and quickness.
He'd be perfect to replace that Gabe Davis role.
And then I do think, so to me, the back end of the first round, I think receivers in play for Buffalo, and I think the defensive line for everything that we just said, getting a little bit younger, getting that depth. They locked up Ed Oliver before last season. You have Oliver, you have Rousseau, but as far as building block pieces on the defensive line, it is pretty thin. So I think going back to the defensive line in the first round, it makes a lot of sense as well.
They need a lot of depth on defense generally. They're another, for the second or third year in a row, they're in this weird spot where they're getting a ton of injured players back. And they're like, well, they'll be better next year because they're getting all these hurt players back, right? And it won't be. And then last year, that was my narrative going into last season, is the Bills' defense will be better because they're getting all these hurt players back.
Including
and there's no way,
Von Miller, one of them. Yeah.
There's no way they can be as injured again as they were last year, and then they all got hurt again. So is that going to happen again? They get all these guys back, and then half the defense gets injured again, and we're still talking about this depleted, banged up, knackered unit? Or are they going to catch the right side of injury luck for a while and actually escape that? One last point I want to make about the Bills. They have a ton of draft picks. They have 10 draft picks, but they're the first team. Yeah. They're the first team we've come across to be in that interesting category that Jim Nagy talked about when we had him on the show, which is day 3 of this draft has been decimated by the entire landscape right now of college football and the extra COVID year and blah, blah, blah. It's not a good year to have a ton of 5th, 6th, and 7th round picks, and that's where most of Buffalo's are. They have, 2 5ths, 3 6th, and a 7th. So, most of their draft capital is on the wrong day, essentially, to have it in this year.
Yeah, 3 picks in the top 100, which is solid. But to your point, of the 10 draft picks, yes, several on day 3.
So I'm curious, do they acknowledge that and say, this is not the year to have a ton of those picks? We need to make moves, whether that's going up to target specific players or whether that's trading back and getting out of this year entirely, trading for future picks, or which way do they play that? Or do they even acknowledge it and just say, this is just another draft, we just pick like we pick?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, and I think at this point with the Bills, depth is the key, right? I think they might be able to bring in several players who will contribute a little bit in year 1, don't necessarily have to, but you're getting them ready for their second year, their third year, when they're going to need to contribute a little bit more. Not a lot of starting opportunities needed to be filled in Buffalo, but it's a depth offseason, I believe. Defensive line, find that deep threat, secondary depth, getting younger in Buffalo.
Yep.
Are they fixed?
Stay the course and just retool the roster. I mean, it's annual, it's maintenance.
Yeah, stay the course. It's really, it's really tough because 31 fan bases lose. There's only one champion every single year. And even with the Chiefs, I say this all the time, right? The Chiefs, if you just flip 2 plays, all of a sudden it's like, oh, the Chiefs aren't the blueprint anymore. The Niners are the blueprint. Let's do what the Niners do. It's like, no, it's a couple plays.
The problem is it doesn't always, so that, you sort of say, well, stay the course, eventually it'll come back in your direction, or eventually you'll get the breaks. Kind of like the concept, like poker, right? If you play it the right way, quote unquote, mathematically, eventually the numbers will come back to you and you'll win more than you'll lose. It doesn't always happen that way in football, though, because the sample size is so small, and you can be the 90s Bills, where you can go 0-4 in the Super Bowl. Staying the course was probably the right call. It doesn't mean that team was somehow fatally flawed and had no shot of ever winning the Super Bowl. They did the right. Getting to 4 of them in a row is an amazing achievement, but you might end up 0-4 sometime, and there's no way of preventing that from happening. Right now, I think the Bills are doing the correct thing. They are in the window. They are capable of winning a Super Bowl in any given season, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen.
The one last thing I want to add about the draft picks, and it might be difficult given Buffalo's cap situation. If can they take a 5 or a 6 and flip that for a potential starter, right? A guy that's making $8 million, $10 million. We've seen other teams do that. Again, you need the cap space and the flexibility to be able to do that. But
the Calais Campbell,
trades, Darius Smith last year. Can you steal a starter, so to speak? That also pushes the cap situation down the road a little bit more. But that's another potential use of those late round picks for Buffalo. All right, Bills fixed.